sound. We're constantly surrounded by it, but we rarely stop to consider how we're engaging with it. Once you become aware of that, you begin to experience sound differently. So in this video, I'd like to share that idea with you. It's called the 4 modes of listening. We've always listened to sound in different ways, but before we invented devices that could record it, it only existed in the moment. You heard it once, and it was gone. Recording changed everything. Now we could hear the same sound again and again and again. And when you repeat a sound, you start noticing things you didn't hear the first time. In the mid-20th century, a French composer and researcher named Pierre Schaeffer began exploring this idea in depth. He became interested in what happens when you separate a sound from its source. And from that came what he called the sound object, a sound considered on its own. The idea that a sound can be listened to for what it truly is, not just what made it. And from that idea, new ways of listening began to emerge. Later, another French theorist, Michel, built on this work and proposed 3 distinct modes of listening. And in teaching contexts, it's often useful to add a 4th one. So what are these 4 modes we're talking about? The first mode of listening is what Michel Chion calls causal listening, to identify. This is when we actively direct our attention to a sound to understand what's producing it and where it's coming from. Without seeing anything, what can you identify in this sound? Even without seeing, your brain is already identifying what's there and roughly where it is. If you hear footsteps behind you, you immediately know someone's there. And so you're not really focused on the sound itself, but rather you're focused on identifying it. So in causal listening, sound becomes a kind of clue, something your brain uses to understand what's happening around you. The second mode is called semantic listening, to understand. This is when we listen in order to understand or extract meaning. In this mode, sound is no longer just something we identify, it becomes something we interpret or translate. The most obvious example of this is language. When someone speaks, you're not focused on the fact that someone is speaking or even on the sound of their voice. You're focused on what they're saying. You're extracting meaning from the sound. But semantic listening is not limited to words. When my dog looks at me and starts to whimper, I understand that it's asking for something. Maybe he's hungry, maybe he wants to go for a walk. The sound itself carries meaning. The same applies to certain signals. In causal listening, we ask, what is it? In semantic listening, we ask, what does it mean? So in this mode, sound becomes a form of communication, or something that conveys information. The third mode is what we call passive listening, to hear. This is the most basic level. It's when sound is present, but we're not actively paying attention to it. And yet, it's still being perceived. For example, you're sitting with someone in a crowded restaurant. There are conversations happening all around you and maybe some soft music in the background, but you're not consciously paying attention to any of it. Or you're in a room with the windows open. You hear the sound of kids playing outside and the hum of distant traffic. When you're in a moving vehicle, how often do you actually notice the sound of the engine or the tires on the road? All of these sounds are still present. They're still entering your ears and being processed by your brain, even though you're not consciously aware of it. So in passive listening, sound is not absent. It's simply in the background of your awareness. And finally, the 4th mode of listening is what Michel Chion calls reduced listening, to listen. Now, this may sound somewhat contradictory, but if you think about it this way, it's about letting go of what the sound represents, so you can hear it for what it truly is. If you listen to the waves of the ocean, you can identify them as waves, as flowing water. But in reduced listening, you set that aside and you focus on the sound itself. The ebb and flow, the rhythm, perhaps the texture of the water as it meets the shore. It's called reduced listening because we shift our attention away from what's producing it and what it means. Instead, we focus on the sound itself, independent of its source and meaning. We're setting aside the cause and the meaning in order to hear its texture, its tone, its shape, its movement. We're listening to it as itself. Here's another way to think about it. Imagine hearing a sound that you've never heard before. If someone living in the 18th century suddenly heard the sound of a modern machine, they wouldn't recognize it as, say, a lawnmower or a tractor. They would hear it simply as it is, without attaching a clear identity or meaning to it. And this is the kind of listening that musicians, composers, and sound designers develop. It allows them to hear details, shape sound, and understand it on a much deeper level. You're no longer asking, what is it? You're listening to what it is. So in conclusion, we move between these different modes naturally without really noticing it. Sometimes we're identifying sounds. Other times we're interpreting meaning. Sometimes sound is simply in the background, and sometimes we're truly listening. And just becoming aware of that can already change how you experience sound. It can make you notice things that you didn't notice before, hear details you might have missed. And if you're a musician, it can change the way you listen and the way you create. You begin to notice things differently, and that naturally influences the choices you make. And for me, that's what makes this idea so interesting.